Coming to paperback and e-readers, Isis Dark Incubus. The goddess next door gets enthralled in a romantic entanglement with an evil incubus in this all-new Isis series adventure. Pre-order your copy of Isis Dark Incubus at Amazon.com and other online booksellers everywhere. One of my viewers wanted to know what my thoughts were about Dr. Fredric Wertham and his book Seduction of the Innocent. Now, the book Seduction of the Innocent was written by Dr. Fredric Wertham, a German-born American child psychiatrist, and published in 1954. And in that book, Dr. Fredric Wertham makes the claim that comic books were a negative form of literature and a serious cause of juvenile delinquency. And all throughout the thesis of Seduction of the Innocent, he says that these comics present violence to young children and negatively influence them, and uses the core of his thesis within crime comics and horror comics and some superhero comics like Batman and Wonder Woman, saying that this material encouraged antisocial behavior in children. Now, in order to reinforce his thesis, Dr. Fredric Wertham took a lot of examples from the popular genre of crime comics that were out and horror comics from publishers like EC at the time, which was the original publisher of Mad Magazine, and also said that there were covert sexual themes inside of books like the Wonder Woman comic and alphabet undertones in books like Batman. And because he believed that these books had negative influences on young children, he believed that these books were being published to seduce children into participating in antisocial behaviors at an early age and would have a negative influence on children as related to their behavior. Now, this book, as it came out, started to become somewhat popular, and as it became a bit popular, this is where a senator, Estes Kovner, decided to put on some hearings as related to comic books, because he was known for having a whole plan as a mob hunter. He was going after organized crime, and he also believed that a lot of times with these comics that they were being distributed by organized crime, and thought that this was being done to influence the minds of young children. Now, this led to a series of hearings in Congress as related to dealing with the content in comics and whether or not it was antisocially influencing children. And as a result of those hearings, this is where the entire comic book industry decided to self-regulate by creating the Comics Code in order to try to avoid having the government put regulations on it. Now, Dr. Fredric Wertham's Seduction of the Innocent does present some points as related to the content in comics. However, the medium of comics as an art form is not an antisocial medium, nor are comic books a negative influence on young children. No, comic books as a medium are actually a positive influence on children, especially boys, because boys are visual individuals, and because boys learn through seeing pictures and observation, comic books help boys learn how to read. And as a boy who learned how to read from comic books, I know that comics in and of themselves as a medium are not a negative form of literature. No, comics are a very good form of literature if they are written and designed by people who have an interest in helping children. They, again, as I said before, are a great way for children, especially boys, to learn how to read. And when you have a good creator out here putting together great content, comic books can become a form of literature that can transform a child's life and introduce them to a world of books and help them open up their imagination. That's where Fredric Wertham got it all twisted about comic books. He got it all twisted because he got caught up in the content that was being published by a small group of publishers and creators, and not understanding the impact and influence of the medium on children. Now, yes, there were creators like William Moulton Marston, who the creator of Wonder Woman, who was looking to use comics to influence children towards promoting his deviant sexual ideas. And there were other creators out there, like the creators at EC Comics, who were putting a lot of graphic and gory pictures in their horror comics. But that was not all about the medium. That was about creators basically going out here and expressing their free speech. But them expressing their free speech, that is something that needed to be regulated by the publisher if the publisher was the one creating the content. And that's where Dr. Fredric Wertham got it all twisted about comics being a cause of juvenile delinquency, because comics aren't a cause of juvenile delinquency. No, what's a cause of juvenile delinquency in a lot of cases are neglectful parents who do not look out for their children, and these children being influenced by individuals who promote antisocial ideas. And yes, again, like William Moulton Marston, there are individuals who do promote antisocial behavior in between the pages of a comic willfully, intentionally, like he did in his Golden Age Wonder Woman comics, where he willfully and intentionally got inspired for the Wonder Woman character using pornography and wanted to promote bondage, sadomasochism, and sexual deviancy as socially acceptable. This was William Moulton Marston in his own words as related to Wonder Woman, and there are other individuals who want to promote other ideas in comics that are antisocial, but that's not what the medium was ever all about. No, the medium of comics was about using art to tell a story, and using art as a visual medium to tell a story about people. And anybody can tell a story with comics and tell a great story that can resonate with people. That's what Dr. Fredric Wertham really didn't understand, and that's what the senator who got caught, Estes Kaufner, got caught up in. They were all caught up in trying to create an agenda as related to saying, oh, comics are antisocial, and wanted to go out here and look to try to censor comics in order to fit their narrative. And sadly, as a result of Estes Kaufner's campaign and the hearings as related to Seduction of the Innocent, a lot of creators wound up losing their jobs, like the people at EC Comics, where they were making horror comics. The entire business lost all of its publications, and that led to many people winding up out of a job as a result. And that was a sad thing to happen, because horror comics, while they were promoting a lot of graphic content, they were basically wound up put out of business because the publishers just could not produce this work without having to deal with public backlash. Now, the Comics Code was put in place because many comic publishers didn't want to see their business regulated or have their First Amendment rights taken. So a lot of comic publishers, as a result of Dr. Fredric Wertham, they wound up trying to save their business, and they wanted to save their business by creating this Comics Code. Now, the Comics Code was created back in the 1950s in order to create a standard so that people could trust the comic books that were coming on store shelves and of drugstores, supermarkets, and other stores, so that people could feel safe about picking up these comics and sharing them with their family and friends. Now, the whole concept of the Comics Code was a good standard. It was a good standard because it basically, what it did was ensure that when you picked up a Marvel comic, a DC comic, an Archie comic, or any other comic out here, you knew that you could go out here and share this book with your children, and those children would not be exposed to nudity, graphic sexual content, or graphic sexual violence, or all sorts of sexual deviancy or criminal behavior, or blood and guts. It was a standard that ensured that the readers of those comics would not be presented with antisocial imagery. And as a kid who grew up in the 70s and the 80s, those books basically, I knew I could trust a Marvel comic or a DC comic because as publishers were a part of this voluntary code, it ensured that these books would meet a standard for quality, that I could go out here and share them with my family and friends and feel safe about sharing them with them and not feeling uncomfortable about what's in between the pages of that comic. Now, in the 80s, as the indie market started to rise, we started to see people walking away from the comics code. And as they walked away from the comics code, what we started to see was people creating comics with a lot more graphic content. Like during the black and white craze, I remember seeing a lot of comics with nudity and sexual situations, and also seeing a lot of comics filled with more blood and guts and gore. And while people did buy these comics, that it started to have an influence on the industry. And as we went from the 80s into the 90s, we started to see comic publishers starting to walk away from the comics code. And we really started to see a lot of comic publishers really thinking highly about walking away from that comics code as Image Comics came into the marketplace. Now, when Jim Lee, Rob Liefeld, and Todd McFarlane formed Image Comics in, I believe, 1991 or so, they decided to not create comics as related to the comics code because they felt Marvel was as tying their hands as related to creativity. And they decided to go out here and create comics with a lot more graphic violence and a lot more blood and guts. And some creators outside of Image started to create comics with more nudity and sexual content. And as these books started to generate far more sales than the traditional Marvel and DC comics, we started to see more publishers like Marvel and DC start to look to walk away from the comics code as related to content. Marvel, I believe, started to walk away from the comics code in the 90s because their content started to get a bit more graphic because they wanted to compete with Image. Now DC, because it was a part of Warner Brothers, decided to stay with the comics code until 2001, and when Dan Didio wound up taking over. And when Dan Didio wound up taking over, he started to escalate the content in comics as related to blood and gore and even sexual violence with the story Identity Crisis. And as a result, the content in comics is these days, I would say, even worse than the comics that Dr. Fredric Wertham came up and complained about, because these days there's no standard, and because there's no standard for content at these comic companies, what we've seen over the last, I'd say, 30 years is a complete decline in sales. Now, short term, and when Image came out, we started to see sales rise as the content became more graphic. However, over the last couple of years, in the last 2 or 3 decades, as the content has become more and more graphic inside of comics, and the violence has become filled with more blood and guts, comic sales have continued to precipitously drop over each decade from the mid-90s to the 2000s to the 2010s. And now comic sales are at an all-time low. And I believe one of the reasons why comic sales are at an all-time low is because most people can't trust what's in between the pages of most modern comics. They can't trust that what's in between those pages will be safe to share with their children, because they don't know if they're going to see some blood and guts in it as related to mutilations. They don't know if they're going to see graphic sexual content. They don't know if they're going to see graphic nudity. And that makes a lot of parents and families uncomfortable about sharing comics with their children. So it's like everything that Dr. Fredric Wertham was saying was about comics being a negative influence on children is one of the things that's really turning off all audiences. And it's turning off audiences because the content just goes way too far these days. And with it going way too far, what's happening is people are not really interested in comics because they believe that these comics basically are filled with antisocial stories, antisocial imagery, and they are not a good influence because people don't feel safe about sharing comics with people. And that's the sole saddest part about the modern comic book industry, is that they didn't really heed the warnings of Dr. Fredric Wertham as related to policing content. Now, when it comes to, again, the medium is not a negative form of literature because Scholastic makes lots of great comics that are all ages and people read them. And there are other great indie comic publishers and great main indie publishers out here creating all ages family content like I do here, try to do on SJS Direct. I mean, at SJS Direct, what I try to do is maintain a standard similar to the Comics Code, in that I have a standard where I try to keep my content for SJS Direct Universe books and comics that I do, like John Haynes at Death's Door. I try to keep these books kind of PG-13 because I know that there are readers of all ages out there. And I know that because there are readers of all ages out there, I try to keep the content of my comics and my books in the SJS Direct universe, like the upcoming ISIS Dark Incubus. I try to keep the content in a PG-13 situation because I want readers to feel safe about giving their books, my books, to their children and sharing those books with the family. That's what I try to do in between the pages of many of the SJS Direct Universe books. Now, there are books that I do that are somewhat R-rated, like the books of the Spinsterella trilogy. Sometimes with some of those books, there is a little bit more coarse language and some adult situations. But even then, I try to keep it not too graphic because I understand people need to feel comfortable about buying books. And that's what the Comics Code ensured. It created a standard that ensured people would feel safe about being able to share these books with their families and friends. And you need that in order to build trust. You need a standard in order to build trust with your customers. You have to really, when you're out here as a publisher, you have to be very careful about what you publish, because what you publish will have an influence on people, and you want to have a positive influence on people to build your word of mouth, because your word of mouth is how you're going to sell your books. That's the thing that people like Dr. Fredric Wertham and many in the publishing industry don't understand. They don't understand that there is a middle ground. A lot of comic publishers don't understand this these days because they were influenced by companies like Image and many of the indies that did well in the 90s with the Bad Girl books, which featured a lot of TNA, but not a lot of substance. I mean, a lot of this is people, they were looking at the money, but not looking at the quality of the content. And that's how people can be influenced antisocially, because there's a difference between a little bit of cheesecake and just something that's just absolutely twisted. You have to be very careful about where you're going as a publisher. That's something that I've learned over the years. You've got to be very careful about the content that you produce, because the content you produce can have a positive influence on a child. Like when I was 4 years old, I mean, comic books basically were the way I learned how to read, and I knew who most of the Avengers were when I was 4 years old, thanks to my brother sharing comics with me. And when my brother shared comics with me, I wanted to give back to the medium that taught me how to read, and I wanted to give back by learning how to make my own comics as far back as 9 years old. And since I couldn't go out here and draw very well, I learned how to tell stories with words, and that made me want to become a comic book writer when I was a teenager. However, things didn't work out, but then eventually I started my own publishing company back in 2009. And as I started that business, I've always wanted to give back to the business of comics, and I wanted to give back to the business of comics. This is why I go out here and hire comic artists to do the covers of my books. I hire comic artists to do the covers of my books as a tribute to the medium that taught me how to read. I mean, I do this because it means a lot to me to share with people my love for comics, and I want to go out here and show that the medium of comics isn't a negative form of literature, because when you look at the images on my comics, my books, these images are positive. And again, it's not the medium that's bad, it's not the artists that are bad. I mean, truly talented artists like Bill Walko and Mike Williams, again, can tell beautiful stories with art, and it's an art form that, if it's in the right hands, can create great storytelling. I mean, I meet many great comic creators out here who have love and passion for this medium, and they want to have a positive impact on the lives of people. But everybody has to understand that in this business, we have to look out for the kids as related to having a standard. If you want to create adult content, yeah, go ahead and create your adult content, but label it so. That's the way it was in the 80s. We used to have the mature readers label, even on books like Green Arrow by Mike Grell, and many other books like The Question by Dennis Cowan, I believe. I mean, if there's more graphic content, then yeah, you need to put a label on it and let people know what that is, not just put it out here and have it out here and kids reading it. People need to know what's in those books, because if they know what's in those books, then you can build the trust with those people, and the ultimate goal is to form that relationship with the customer where they feel safe about buying those books. And that's one of the things I try to do here at SJS Direct, because I understand that people like Fredric Wertham can take your material and twist it, and that's why you have to be able to start controlling your narrative. And the way you control your narrative is by controlling your content and having a standard for content where you're going to try to keep things in a PG-13 environment. Now, I know not all books can do this, because there are some books that just can't do it because the content is that way. But the whole thing is you want to be transparent and upfront, because the whole thing is with certain genres like superhero comics, I believe that needs to be a PG-13, all ages place. And with other genres, you can go out here and explore. And if you want to go out here and explore, but still, please let people know so that they won't go out here and take the medium of comics and make a twisted generalization the way Fredric Wertham did with Seduction of the Innocent. Now, if you want to pick up my first full comic, John Haynes at Death's Door, you can find that comic in paperback on lulu.com by clicking the links in the description box. And if you want to check out my first digital comic, Esteem No Good Deed, which I did with Bill Walko, you can find that comic on Kindle for 99 cents right now, and that 8-page comic is a lot of all ages family fun. You can find that comic also in the paperback version of Esteem, Blast from the Past, and you can find that book along with all the other SJS Direct Universe titles on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find SJS Direct Universe titles at other online booksellers like Draft to Digital, Google Play, Barnes & Noble, and you can also find them at online in paperback versions at Barnes & Noble and big box retailers like Walmart and Target. Now, this was a video requested by a viewer, and if you want to request a video about comics and the medium of comics, you can send a donation of a minimum of $15 to the Cash App or the PayPal by clicking the links in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Coming to paperback and e-readers, Esteem Horror in the Hamptons. The aspiring angel tries to escape a house of horrors in this all-new Esteem series adventure. Pre-order your copy of Esteem Horror in the Hamptons in digital format at Amazon.com, Google Play, Draft2Digital, and other digital booksellers, or pick up your paperback copy on May 24th. Coming to paperback and e-readers, John Haynes, Illuminati. The man who rules the world takes on the head of the global elite in this action-packed, all-new John Haynes series adventure. Pre-order your copy of John Haynes' Illuminati on Amazon.com and online booksellers everywhere. Now available on Lulu. John Haynes at Death's Door. The man who rules the world takes on the Greek god of death in this action-packed, all-new John Haynes comic book. Get your copy of the first John Haynes comic at Lulu.com today. Support Black-owned and Black-operated digital broadcast media. www.niceradionetwork.com. Nice Radio Network, broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.